The fire had burned down to its last warmth when the nightjars went silent. It was the kind of silence that arrives without announcement, not the natural quiet that settles over the Serengeti in the deep hours, but a held-breath stillness, as though the grass itself had decided to stop moving. Elias noticed it the way he noticed most things in the bush, not with alarm, but with a slow shift of attention, the way a man turns his head when something at the edge of his vision changes shape. He had been at the camp table for the better part of an hour, working through the field notes from the previous day by the light of a single lantern. The reserve stretched out in all directions beyond the reach of that light, a darkness so complete and so alive that it had its own texture, its own temperature. He was used to it. 19 years had made the Serengeti's nighttime rhythms as familiar to him as his own breathing. The distant lowing of a wildebeest, the brief escalating call of a jackal, the soft percussion of something moving through dry grass 100 meters out, these were not disturbances, but the ordinary language of a landscape that never fully slept. But when the nightjars stopped, Elias put down his pen. He looked toward the southern perimeter of the camp, where the firelight thinned into suggestion, and the acacia shadows dissolved into open plain. The coals in the pit had faded to a low orange pulse, barely enough to push the darkness back, and for a moment he saw nothing but the familiar edge of what light could reach. Then he saw her. She was standing 12 meters out, at the precise boundary where the camp's last warmth gave way to the open dark. A female cheetah, her spotted coat reading silver and shadow in the dying firelight, her lean body absolutely still. She was not crouched. She was not low. She stood in full height, upright and deliberate, in the posture of an animal that had chosen to be seen. Her tail moved in a slow, controlled arc, not the quick lashing of fear, not the loose swing of ease, something steadier and more purposeful than either. It moved the way a pendulum moves, back and forth, like the outer expression of something turning carefully over inside her. Elias did not stand. He did not reach for his radio, or his torch, or his field jacket hanging from the back of his chair. He understood, without being able to fully articulate why, that any sudden motion would cost him something he had not yet been given, and he was not willing to pay that price without knowing first what was being offered. So he watched her. She was an adult female, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. He could not be certain at this distance, in this light, but her proportions spoke of full maturity, and there was something in her bearing that suggested she had survived long enough to know what survival required. Her eyes caught the glow of the coals and held it, 2 amber points of steady light in the darkness, and they were fixed on him with a quality of attention that made him feel, in a way he had felt only rarely in his years in the field, genuinely observed. She had come to the camp. She had not drifted past it or stumbled into its radius by accident. She had walked to this specific circle of light and stopped, and she was waiting for something in the way that wild animals wait when their waiting has a purpose. He had read fear in cheetahs before. He had read curiosity, aggression, the wary sideways withdrawal of an animal that has assessed a situation and found it wanting. He had sat in enough hides and walked enough transects and spent enough long nights at the edge of the dark to know the difference between what a cheetah's body said when it was uncertain and what it said when it had made a decision. What he was looking at now was a decision. She took 3 steps forward and stopped again. Her left shoulder was visible in the light for a moment, old scar tissue there, pale and silvered, a healed wound from some earlier season of difficulty, and then she shifted her weight, and the shadow reclaimed it. Her eyes never left his face. Elias folded his hands on the table. He breathed slowly. He let the silence between them exist without filling it, without the common human impulse to speak into discomfort or move through uncertainty. He had learned this from years of patience, and also from mistakes, the times he had moved too quickly and watched trust evaporate like morning water on hot stone. She looked away from him then, for the first time, not toward the plain, not toward the perimeter of the camp, but behind her a deliberate rotation of her head, slow and full, toward the darkness at her back. She held it for 2, 3, 4 seconds. Then she turned back to him. She did it again. The second time, he was already certain. The first time could be read as wariness, as an animal checking its retreat, but the second time the exact same gesture, the same duration, the same return to his face was not a retreat, it was a direction. It was the clearest thing she had said since arriving at the edge of his light, and it said, "This way." He stood up from his chair slowly, the legs scraping once against the dry earth. She did not flinch, did not shift her weight, did not widen her stance in the way animals do when a human's sudden height becomes a threat. She watched him stand and she waited, and her tail continued its slow, patient arc. He took his torch from the table but left it dark. He left the radio where it was. The moon gave enough a quarter slice of pale light that silvered the grass and threw soft shadows across the plain. He walked toward her with his arms loose at his sides, his steps even and unhurried, and she held her ground until he was perhaps 6 meters away. Then she turned and walked into the grass, and Elias followed her into the dark, the coals dimming behind him, the camp, and its light growing smaller with each step, the Serengeti opening up ahead in that vast and particular silence that precedes whatever the night has decided to give. The grass swallowed the camp behind him in less than a minute. Elias kept his eyes on the shape moving ahead, the low, fluid outline of her body shifting through pale silver grass, visible and then not. The spotted coat breaking apart against the pattern of shadow and moonlight, the way all cheetahs eventually do when the land decides to keep them. He did not try to close the distance between them. He matched her pace, which was neither rushed nor leisurely but purposeful, the walk of an animal that knows exactly where it is going and has already calculated how much time it can afford to spend getting there. The ground under his feet changed subtly as they moved away from camp, harder, drier. The soil cracked in the way that soil cracks after a long stretch without rain, the cracks running in patterns that caught the moonlight like thin veins in pale stone. The grass thinned in places and thickened in others, and the acacia trees stood at wide intervals, their flat crowns dark against a sky so full of stars it seemed almost weighted by them. He had walked this stretch of land hundreds of times in daylight. At this hour, under this light, it had the particular quality of a place that exists slightly outside of ordinary time. She stopped once, about 200 meters from the camp perimeter. She turned and looked back at him, and he slowed but did not stop, and after a moment she turned forward again and continued. He understood the pause as assessment. She was confirming he was still there, still following, still moving in the same quiet way he had moved since leaving the table. He passed whatever that assessment required of him because she did not hesitate again. They walked for perhaps 4 minutes total. Then the ground dipped slightly, a shallow depression in the earth, natural and unremarkable, the kind that forms over years from seasonal water movement and the slow subsidence of soil. A fallen acacia branch lay across one side of it, thick enough to provide a low barrier against wind, pale and dry, stripped of bark by seasons of heat and insects. It was exactly the kind of place a mother cheetah would choose, sheltered without being enclosed, hidden without being inaccessible. He heard them before he saw them, a sound so small it barely qualified as sound, a soft, thin pulse of breath, slightly irregular, coming from the depression ahead. Then the quiet shuffling of small bodies in dry grass. Then the higher, cleaner sound of 2 cubs moving toward their returning mother, their feet quick and light, their calls a series of soft, urgent churs that cut straight through the night silence. Elias stopped 3 meters back from the edge of the depression and looked down into it. There were 3 cubs. The 2 that had come toward their mother were small but lively, their legs still carrying the disproportionate wobble of very young animals, their coats dark and thick in the way cheetah cubs carry their coats in the first weeks of life, that deep, heavily marked juvenility that would lighten and refine with time. They pressed themselves against her flanks immediately, pushing their heads under her chin, seeking the reassurance of her warmth and smell. The 3rd cub had not moved. It lay slightly apart from the hollow where the other 2 had been resting, its small body oriented toward the fallen branch, as though it had turned in the night and not found the energy to turn back. Its legs were extended rather than curled, not the relaxed extension of deep sleep, but the loose, insufficient extension of a body that had stopped organizing itself for comfort. Its spotted coat rose and fell in short, shallow intervals, each breath incomplete, each cycle slightly too rapid, the chest working harder than it should have needed to for such small lungs and such still air. One of its hind legs lay at an angle that was not quite right. There was no wound visible, no blood, no swelling that Elias could see from where he stood. Whatever had happened to it had happened inside, where the body keeps its most important and most fragile work. The mother moved to the weak cub immediately. She lowered her head and pressed her nose against its side, a long, still contact, her breath warm against the dark fur. She held that position for several seconds. The cub made a sound in response, thin, barely voiced, more vibration than call, like an instrument whose string has been wound too loose. It was the most honest sound Elias had ever heard. It carried no information except the fact of its own continuation. The mother raised her head and looked at Elias. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at the cub, then back to him. He had seen animals look at humans before in moments of duress, the panicked scanning of an injured animal searching for escape, the hard, fixed stare of threat assessment, the glassy, unfocused look of a creature in shock. This was none of those things. This was something quieter and more difficult to name. It was the look of an animal at the outer boundary of what it knew how to do. She circled the depression. She moved around the outside of it in a slow, controlled loop, stepping over the fallen branch and back, pausing at intervals to look at the weak cub and then at the man standing at the edge of the grass. Her tail moved in that same measured arc. Her paws made almost no sound in the dry earth. She was not agitated in the way that fear produces agitation. There was no urgency in her movement, no chaotic energy, but she was not calm either. She was a mother doing the only thing left available to her after everything else. And the fact that Elias was watching her do it seemed, in some way that neither of them could have explained, to be the entire point. He crouched down into the grass, slowly, all the way down, until he was low enough that his height no longer read as dominance in the language both of them were using without speaking. The mother paused in her circling and watched him lower himself, and did not step between him and her cubs. That absence of protective intervention was precise and significant. It was trust arriving not as a feeling but as a physical fact. "I see her," he said quietly, not to the cheetah specifically, not to the night. Just to say it, the way a person speaks a true thing aloud because some truths need to exist outside the body. The mother completed one more slow circuit, and then she stopped moving. She stood at the edge of the depression, close to the weak cub, and she was still. The two healthy cubs had settled again against the warmth of the fallen branch, their small sides rising and falling with the easy, uncomplicated rhythm of animals whose bodies are doing exactly what bodies are supposed to do. The weakest cub breathed its shallow, labored breaths. The Serengeti held everything in its enormous, indifferent quiet, and Elias stayed where he was low in the grass, still as the stone beneath him, while the mother stood beside her smallest one and waited for whatever this man she had walked to in the dark was going to do. He reached for his radio. It was the logical next step, the step that 19 years of field protocol had made automatic, the one that every ranger in every reserve across the continent would have taken without deliberation. There was an injured cub. There was a mother in distress. There were resources back at camp, a field kit, an electrolyte solution, a thermal wrap, a researcher with more medical training than he carried in his hands. The radio was in his jacket pocket, and his hand found it in the dark without needing to look. He held it there for a moment without pressing anything. The weak cub breathed its shallow, insufficient breaths. The mother stood at the edge of the depression, still and watchful, her eyes moving between the small, spotted body on the ground and the man crouching in the grass 3 meters away. The two healthy cubs had quieted again against the fallen branch, their small warmth pressed together in the uncomplicated way of young animals who trust that the world will hold them through the night. Elias looked at the mother. He looked at the cub. He looked at the particular quality of stillness that existed in this depression at this hour, fragile and specific, assembled from the darkness and the cold and the accumulated trust of the last 20 minutes, and he understood with a certainty that arrived not as thought but as instinct, that if he raised that radio to his mouth and broke silence with his own voice calling out into the night, something in this arrangement would shift in a way that could not be shifted back. So he put the radio back in his pocket. And then he did the thing that nobody who knew him would have predicted, and nobody who later heard the account of that night could quite absorb without sitting with it for a while. He sat down, fully and deliberately, in the dry grass beside the depression, cross-legged and open-handed, with the unhurried ease of a man settling in for the duration of something, not crouching at the ready, not positioning himself for action, sitting, the way a person sits when they have decided that their presence is the most useful thing they have to offer, and that their presence requires no further justification than itself. The mother cheetah's tail stopped moving. It did not slow and then stop. It simply ceased, mid-arc, as though whatever calculation had been driving it had just resolved. She watched him sit with the full attention of an animal recalibrating, reassessing, running the unfamiliar data of this human's behavior against every category of human behavior she had ever witnessed or inherited through deep instinct, and finding that it matched none of them. He did not look away from her. He did not speak. He rested his hands loosely on his knees and breathed and let the night continue around him without trying to direct it anywhere. She took one step toward the weak cub, then another. She lowered her head and touched her nose briefly to the cub's side, a quick, firm contact, checking, and then she raised her head and looked at Elias again with that quality of attention he had first seen at the camp's edge. It was different now, slightly. The urgency in it had not gone, but it had changed shape. It had become something closer to a question being held rather than a question being asked. He stayed as he was. The Serengeti at that hour carries a cold that is not aggressive but pervasive. It comes from the ground upward, from the sky downward, and settles into everything that stays still long enough to receive it. Elias felt it in the backs of his hands and across his shoulders. The grass around him was pale in the moonlight, each blade edged with a faint sheen, and the plain beyond the depression extended in all directions with the quiet immensity that had drawn him to this work before he had the language to explain why. Then the mother cheetah lowered herself to the ground. She did not do it quickly. She folded one front leg and then the other, settled her haunches, and came down onto her side in the grass beside her cubs with the slow, deliberate motion of an animal releasing something it has been carrying for a very long time. Her legs stretched out. Her sides expanded with a breath that was longer and deeper than any breath Elias had seen her take since she appeared at the edge of the camp. The two healthy cubs stirred and pressed closer to her warmth. The weak cub lay where it had lain, but the distance between it and its mother was now measured in centimeters rather than the gulf it had seemed before. Something had shifted. Not in any dramatic or visible way, no single thing had changed in the depression. No crisis had been resolved. No wound had closed. But the quality of the air between the woman and the animal and the small struggling life on the ground had altered in the way that the quality of a room alters when someone in it finally stops pretending that everything is fine. She had stopped pacing. In the hours before she had come to the camp, however many hours that had been, whatever circuit of fear and effort and diminishing options had preceded that walk across the dark plain she had been moving. Elias understood this without having witnessed it. He understood it the way he understood most things about the animals he had spent his life beside, not through observation of this specific moment, but through the accumulated knowledge of what it costs a cheetah mother to be still when one of her cubs is failing. Stillness, for an animal in distress, is not rest. It is the end of options. She had paced, because pacing was the last thing her body knew how to do with the urgency inside it. And now she had stopped because something outside her had absorbed enough of that urgency to make stillness possible again. Elias reached carefully into his jacket pocket, moving with the deliberate slowness that had become his only available speed since following her into the grass, and took out the radio. He pressed the call button once, quietly, without raising it to his mouth and without speaking. It was a signal agreed upon months ago for exactly this category of situation, the single press that meant, "Come quietly, bring the kit, do not hurry." 3 meters away, the mother cheetah lay beside her cubs in the silver grass and did not look at him when he did it. She was watching the weak cub now, her eyes steady and close, her body finally at rest against the cold earth. "That's it," he said softly, almost to himself, almost to the night. "That's it." The grass moved in a faint cold wind, and the plain was quiet, and the smallest cub's chest continued its shallow and imperfect rising, but it was rising, and Elias sat beside it in the dark and waited for Priya to come. Priya arrived the way Elias had hoped she would, without a word, without a torch, moving through the grass with the careful economy of someone who understood that the situation she was entering had its own established terms and that her first responsibility was not to disturb them. She stopped at the edge of the depression, read what was in front of her in a single long look, and lowered herself to the ground without being asked. Her field bag came off her shoulder slowly, set down beside her with both hands rather than dropped, and she opened it by feel rather than by light. She had worked alongside Elias on this reserve for 6 years. She knew, without needing it explained, that whatever had been built in this hollow over the last half hour was more important than her efficiency. The mother cheetah raised her head when Priya settled. Her eyes moved across the new figure with the particular focus of an animal taking inventory, cataloging height, movement quality, smell, the specific quality of stillness a person projects when they are either trustworthy or performing trust. Priya sat with her hands open and visible in her lap. She did not look directly at the cheetah. She looked at the weak cub, and after a long moment, the mother lowered her head back to the grass. The night moved through its coldest hours, with the slow indifference that nights in the Serengeti reserve for the time between midnight and dawn, when the land seems to withdraw even further into itself and the stars overhead achieve a brightness so concentrated it borders on pressure. Elias remained where he had been sitting. Priya worked from her position with the methodical patience of someone performing surgery on time itself, each movement separated from the next by exactly as much stillness as the situation required. She placed a thermal wrap near the weak cub first. Not against it, not wrapped around it, but close enough that the warmth radiated outward in a slow, gentle radius. The cub's nose worked at the changed air near it, a faint, reflexive investigation, the nostrils pulling in information even when the rest of the body lacked the energy to respond to what they found. The mother lifted her head briefly at the new smell, then settled again. Her acceptance of the object was not enthusiastic. It was simply the absence of rejection, which, at that hour, in that place, was the same thing. Over the following hour, Priya administered a small amount of electrolyte solution by syringe, working in intervals, each dose separated by long pauses that allowed the cub's body to signal whether it was receiving or refusing. The mother watched each of these interventions with full attention. She did not interfere. She did not move away. She lay beside her cubs and observed with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to animals who have arrived at the limit of their own capability and are, in some fundamental biological sense, waiting to see what something else can do. Kofi arrived before 4, called in on the same single-press signal. He was younger than both Elias and Priya, 2 years into his first full posting on the reserve, and the sight that met him at the depression, a cheetah mother lying in the grass, beside 2 rangers in the dark, the space between them organized around something small and barely breathing, stopped him at the perimeter for a long moment before he found his feet again and made his way carefully to Priya's side. The hours that followed were not dramatic. They were the opposite of dramatic. They were the long, patient middle distance of genuine care, the kind that does not announce itself and does not require an audience. The cub's breathing remained shallow, but gradually, over the course of those dark hours, it changed in a way that was almost too subtle to measure and yet unmistakable to anyone who had been watching long enough. The intervals between breaths lengthened slightly. The chest's frantic, shallow pulling settled by degrees into something with more depth to it, more completion. The color in the gums, checked once by Priya with a torch held sideways and low, had shifted from the pale concern of earlier to something closer to the pink of a body remembering its own warmth. Elias watched all of this from his position in the grass and did not move from it. The sky began to change before the sun arrived to explain why. The darkness overhead shifted its quality in the east, a barely perceptible lightening, less a color than a suggestion of one, the first tentative signal that the night had reached its outer boundary and was beginning the long process of withdrawal. The grass, which had been silver, became gray. The fallen acacia branch beside the depression revealed its texture. The stars overhead did not disappear so much as recede, pulling back from the foreground of the sky to something further and less immediate. The weak cub lifted its head at first light. It did not do it easily. The movement was slow and imprecise, the head rising from the ground with the particular effortfulness of a body, discovering that effort is once again possible, wavering slightly at the top of the motion, the neck not quite steady, but finding its balance and holding it. The eyes opened fully for the first time in hours, dark and clear and present, focused on the warm shape of its mother beside it. It made a sound, the soft churring call of a cheetah cub seeking contact stronger than the thin thread of sound it had managed in the night, more formed, carrying in it the specific quality of something that has come back from a far place and found, with surprise and relief, that the world it left is still there. The mother rose immediately and moved to her cub. She lowered her head and began to groom it, long, deliberate strokes from the top of the head down the back, firm and rhythmic and continuous. The ancient mammalian language of recognition and reclamation. The two healthy cubs stirred and pressed close, and the small family contracted around its smallest member in the easy, unconscious way of animals, whose bodies know what belonging requires before the mind has time to form the thought. Elias stood up. He did not say anything. He did not look at Priya or at Kofi. He picked up his jacket from the grass where it had fallen at some point in the night, turned, and walked away from the depression back through the pale morning grass, back toward the camp, the light growing around him with each step. Priya watched him go. She looked at Kofi. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the morning was not already saying more quietly and more completely than any of them could have managed. The cub was alive. The mother was grooming. The Serengeti was turning gold at its edges in the way it turned gold every morning, as though nothing had happened, as though everything had happened. Priya closed her field bag. She held it in her lap for a moment and looked at the family in the depression below her, the three small bodies, the long spotted flank of the mother rising and falling in the new light, and then she, too, stood and walked back toward camp without disturbing any of it further. By the time Elias reached the camp, the coffee was already on. Kofi had come back ahead of him and started it without being asked. The way people perform small, practical acts when they find themselves in the presence of something too large for words and need their hands to have a purpose. The camp table held two enamel cups and the familiar smell of it rose into the morning air, grounding and ordinary, and Elias sat down in his chair, the same chair he had been sitting in when the nightjars went silent, and wrapped both hands around a cup and looked out at the plain without speaking. Priya came in 20 minutes later and sat across from him. She poured her own coffee, and they drank in the quiet that had settled over the camp like something earned. The sun was climbing the eastern sky with the unhurried confidence of a thing that has performed this particular task an uncountable number of times, and has no reason to rush it. The light it threw across the Serengeti was the specific gold of early morning, warm and lateral, catching every blade of grass at an angle that made each one briefly luminous, the plain stretching outward in all that light like something being slowly revealed after a long concealment. Elias did not go back to the depression. He had made that decision somewhere on the walk back through the grass, without deliberating over it, the way he made most of his decisions in the field, not by weighing options but by listening to the part of him that had been trained by years of attention to know what a situation required and, perhaps more importantly, what it did not. It was Priya who went, an hour later, with her binoculars and the careful quiet she had carried with her since arriving at the depression in the dark. She walked to the southern edge of the camp and stood there for several minutes, and then she came back and sat down across from Elias and said simply that they were moving. He nodded. He did not ask which direction or how fast or whether the smallest cub was keeping pace, though all three questions existed somewhere in him. He had learned, over the course of 19 years, that there were moments when information was exactly what a moment did not need, and this was one of them. What he knew was enough. They were moving. The family was intact. The night had given back what it had seemed, at its worst hours, to be in the process of taking. He picked up his coffee and walked to the southern edge of the camp himself. They were visible from there, four shapes moving through the open grassland to the northeast, still close enough that the binoculars were not necessary, though the detail at that distance was soft and impressionistic rather than precise. The mother moved in the long, ground-covering stride of a cheetah with a direction and enough energy to pursue it. The two healthy cubs moved alongside her in the loose, intermittently distracted way of young animals for whom the world remains a series of unresolved investigations veering slightly, correcting, pressing back toward their mother's flank. And the smallest cub walked beside her, its stride not matching hers in length but matching it in intention, its head carried level, its body moving forward across the gold grass with the particular quality of effort that belongs to things still in the process of returning to themselves. Elias stood at the camp's edge and watched them cross the plain. He was not aware, at first, that the mother had stopped. The two healthy cubs continued forward a few steps before registering the pause and circling back, and it was their small detour that drew his eye to the point where the family had come to rest, perhaps 300 meters out, at the place where the shorter grass of the open plain began to give way to the taller, denser growth that marked the transition toward the acacia line. She had turned around. She was facing the camp directly, her body still, her tail low. At that distance, her eyes were not visible, but her orientation was unmistakable, the full frontal attention of an animal looking at a specific thing in a specific place for a specific reason. The two healthy cubs pressed against her, unbothered, already beginning the low wrestling that occupied most of their waking hours. The smallest cub stood slightly apart from its siblings, also still, its small face turned in the same direction as its mother's. Elias did not move. He did not raise his hand, or step forward, or make any gesture that crossed the distance between them. He understood, with the clarity that the whole of the preceding night had been building toward, that this moment did not require anything from him. It was not an invitation. It was not a farewell in the way that human farewells are constructed with intention and meaning and the desire to be understood. It was simpler and more complete than that. It was a wild animal pausing at the edge of one world before entering another, and the pause itself was the whole of what it needed to be. He stood still and let her look. The mother held her position for a long moment, long enough that Kofi, who had come to stand a few meters behind Elias without either of them acknowledging the other's presence, would later say that it felt like the plain itself had stopped to pay attention. The grass moved around her in a faint, warm current of morning air, bending and recovering, the whole field of it in constant small motion, while she remained in the center of it without moving at all. Then she turned and walked into the tall grass, and the grass closed behind her the way grass does immediately, completely, without evidence. The two healthy cubs disappeared after her. The smallest cub paused for one more second at the boundary between short grass and tall, its small body at the threshold, and then it too stepped forward and was gone. Elias stood at the edge of the camp for a long time after they disappeared. The plain stretched out in front of him, gold and enormous and unmarked, giving nothing back of what had passed across it in the night and the morning. A hornbill flew overhead on its way to somewhere else, bright and purposeful and indifferent to the human standing below it with a cooling cup of coffee in both hands. "Come on," Kofi said quietly, from behind him. "I'll make more." Elias turned away from the plain and walked back into the camp. He would write the incident report that afternoon. He would note the cub's condition, the interventions used, the outcome. He would file it, and it would become a record somewhere in the long, accumulated documentation of life on this reserve. But the thing that had actually happened, the walk through the dark, the hollow in the earth, the mother lowering herself into the grass because a man had chosen to simply sit, that would not fit into any report he knew how to write. He did not try to carry it in language. He let it settle into him the way the Serengeti settles into the people who stay long enough to receive it quietly, permanently, below the level of words. The plain was empty and golden. The tall grass at the acacia line stood undisturbed in the warm morning air. Somewhere beyond it, a family moved together through a world that had held them through the night, and the day opened ahead of them, without limit, without condition, carrying them forward into its own enormous and ordinary light.